Why is it unacceptable for Iran to threaten global shipping, but acceptable to restrict trade around waters around Cuba? So this is March 29, 2026. Two stories broke on the same day. In the Caribbean, a Russian oil tanker docked in Havana, carrying 100,000 tons of fuel, enough to keep Cuba running for months. The US president personally intervened to let it through, calling it a humanitarian exception. But at the same time, tension is rising in one of the most critical waterways on earth, the Strait of Hormuz, because Iran has again signaled it could restrict access if it came under attack. Remember, the Strait of Hormuz is the route through which roughly 20% of the world's oil and gas flows. And whenever that threat appears, the response is immediate, with warnings and threats, and calls to protect freedom of navigation under international law. But here is what's being overlooked. Why is restricting global trade seems as unacceptable in the Strait of Hormuz, but tolerated when it comes to international waters around Cuba? What has Cuba done to justify more than 60 years of policies that 187 United Nations member states have repeatedly condemned? Welcome to Aussie Perspective. On this channel, I take widely accepted global ideas, narratives, and assumptions, and I look at them differently. Because too many things are accepted simply because they have been repeated for a long time. So here the aim is to slow down, think clearly, and question ideas that are rarely questioned properly. You see, it's important to understand that the embargo on Cuba is not just a Cold War relic. Because in 2026, it is still very much active. And I would argue even more consequential than ever before. And here's what that looks like. You see, Cuba depends heavily on imported fuel. So when those supplies are disrupted, then the effects are immediate. With power outages, hospitals struggling to function, especially critical systems like incubators that babies need to survive. And in recent times, the issue around Venezuela, once a key supplier of oil to Cuba, have made things even more fragile. In fact, Cuban officials call this economic warfare. And whether or not you agree with the language, the humanitarian impact is hard to ignore. Because hospitals are running on backup generators. Critical procedures are delayed and in some instances postponed indefinitely. The economy of the country remains under immense pressure. Over 6 decades, the United Nations estimated the cost to the Cuban economy has exceeded $150 billion. So at what point does a sanction start to resemble a siege? Now, if we go back to the core issue here, relating to the Strait of Hormuz, you see, the route has global consensus. The world has agreed that the strait must be open at almost any cost because of the impact on global trade. And that's understandable. But when you compare it with Cuba, a country just 90 miles from the United States, where trade is not protected but restricted through visible naval blockade, but also through sanctions, financial pressure, and policies that discourage ships, companies, and even entire countries from engaging. So if freedom of navigation is essential in the Strait of Hormuz, then why does it seem negotiable when it comes to waters around Cuba. So remember, this is not about the geography of the body of water. This is about consistency and whether international laws and rules are applied equally. But I think to understand this, we have to go back a few decades. You see, before 1959, Cuba's economy was closely tied to the United States. And American companies controlled major sectors like sugar, general infrastructure, tourism. And again, politically, the country was led by President Batista, a US-backed dictator. But all that changed with the Cuban Revolution. Because when Fidel Castro came to power, his government nationalized foreign-owned assets, including American property. But Cuba did offer compensation talks, which several countries accepted, but the United States did not. Instead, in 1962, President Kennedy authorized a full embargo on Cuba. Then in 1996, the Helms-Burton Act extended its reach globally, penalizing foreign companies that do business with Cuba. So what began as a response to nationalization of assets became a long-term policy with global impact. If we fast forward to today, there are reports of quiet negotiation between Havana and Washington, but the details remain unclear. But the themes are familiar. The Americans want economic opening, political concessions, change of regime, structural changes. And in exchange, America says that they would potentially relieve decades of restrictions on Cuba. But for Cuba, the stakes are enormous, because this is about the sovereign nature of the state, the ability for Cuba to choose its own system without external pressure. Meanwhile, countries like Russia and China continue to offer limited support to Cuba, placing it within a wider geopolitical struggle. But the embargo remains, largely without global consensus. So back to the central question here. When global trade routes are threatened, we see rapid, coordinated action to protect from across the world. But when it comes to Cuba, restrictions lasting decades remain in place, with no one speaking up. So you see, same principle, different application. So is this really about security, or is it about influence? Because if rules are applied sometimes, then they're not really rules. They are tools of one country to control another. If this perspective made you think or challenge how you see Cuba and the contradictions around it, then please take a moment to engage with it. Either way, the conversation does not end here. This is Ozzy Perspective. Thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next one.